Thank you again for joining me. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter, and welcome to the Empowering Neurologist. The question is, what happens when we don't rein in how our minds are working? What kind of trouble do we get into? Well, we know that if we're not careful with how we direct the functionality of our minds, it's an interesting topic, that it can lead to lifestyle choices that can have health consequences and even mood issues like anxiety and depression. Certainly these days there are a lot of extrinsic issues that are threatening our ability to remain with the program, as it were, as it relates to the functionality of our minds. But the incredible news is there's a lot we can be doing day to day to gain control over the thought processes that make up our waking and even our sleeping hours, for that matter. And we're going to explore that today with our guest, Dr. Carolyn Leaf. She is the author of a new book called Cleaning Up, you're going to love the title, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess. We all have mental mess. And as Dr. Leaf will explain to us, it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's part of life, and we can do a lot about it. I'm going to read to you the subtitle, 5 Simple Scientifically Proven Steps to Reduce Anxiety, Stress, and, really importantly, Toxic Thinking. We can change how we think. We can change how we conceptualize our experiences. We can change what those experiences do to us and how we respond. We're going to learn those tools right now. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Leaf. She's a communication pathologist and cognitive neuroscientist with a master's and PhD in communication pathology from the University of Cape Town and the University of Pretoria. You know where that is, South Africa, specializing in cognitive and metacognitive neuropsychology. Since the early 1980s, she's been researching the mind-brain connection, which we will talk about today, the nature of mental health, and the formation of memory. How do we learn things? She was one of the first individuals to study how the brain can actually change, a topic that we've covered quite a bit, called neuroplasticity, and how neuroplasticity, the changes in the brain, happens with directed mind input. She's currently conducting clinical trials using what we're going to talk about today, her 5-step program that she developed while in private practice to further demonstrate the effectiveness of what she calls mind-directed techniques to help relieve mental ill health problems such as anxiety, depression, intrusive thoughts. And the primary aim of these trials is to make mental health care more affordable. This type of mental health care is certainly more applicable and accessible worldwide. And further, to reduce the stigma that is associated with mental health issues. Dr. Leaf's work has literally transformed the lives of hundreds of thousands of individuals with a variety of challenges like traumatic brain injury, CTE, chronic traumatic encephalopathy that we see mostly described in people involved in contact sports, as well learning disabilities, ADD, ADHD, dementias, autism, and as mentioned, mental health issues like anxiety and depression. You've probably seen her on YouTube, on various podcasts, including here before, and TV episodes, and she has reached virtually millions of people globally. Again, the new book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, it's a task for all of us, and we're going to explore that task right now. Dr. Leaf, welcome back to the Empowering Neurologist. How are you doing?
Oh, I'm doing so well, and it's so great to see you again, David. It's wonderful and exciting to talk about the subject of brain and mind that we both love so much.
Well, you look really healthy, so you've got to be doing something right. Right off the bat, what I want to ask you is, what do you mean mental mess? What's that all about?
Well, the mental mess, basically, if you're human, which we are, and you're alive, you are going to be battling with your mind. And our mind is always working. So it's the one thing that if you're alive, your mind is always working. We can go 3 weeks without food. We can go 3 days without water, more or less. we can go 3 minutes without oxygen, more or less, but we don't even go 3 seconds without using our mind. So if our mind is always working in response to life, it's so easy to get into a mental mess. So the whole point of this book is to help people understand mind, what it is, and to accept that we do battle and we do make a mental mess, and that's okay, and how to fix it. So really, mental mess is just the mistakes we make, not dealing with traumas, not dealing with toxic habits, the day-to-day stuff of just dealing with the crises of any day, running a business, being a parent, being a person. So it's all those factors.
Early in the book, you drew an interesting connection, something we've been looking at as well, that our minds, when they're, as they say, messed up, when we have mental mess, we make poor decisions. It affects our decision-making ability, locking us into, not locking, but persuading us to make less salubrious decisions in terms of our lifestyle choices that may ultimately play out as illness. And that then feeds back to more mental mess. It sounds like a feed-forward continuum that we need to break. So how is it that our minds are then affecting our bodies and then back to our minds?
So I think the place to start is to understand what mind is and what brain is, and the relationship. And I always explain that mind and brain are separate but inseparable. So we've got to, you can't work without the two together, but they are separate. And the way I see mind, and this is what I've been looking at for the last 38 years, I see mind as all the elements of consciousness and unconscious and subconscious. So not just consciousness. As you know, as a scientist as well, the mind is considered the hard question of science. But for me, mind is the most obvious question of science, because right now we're using our mind just to have this discussion. People are using their mind to listen. People are using their mind all the time. So if we look at mind, what I've tried to do is define mind, and this then links into your work. Mind is think, feel, and choose. So when you think, which you're always doing, you will feel. We never think without bringing in our emotions. And when we think and feel, we make choices. So think, feel, choose, we're always doing that. And that's our mind in action. So how we think and how we feel and how we choose is very much is going to have a massive impact on how we function on a physical level, because that thinking, feeling, choosing is mind in action. We're always doing that in response to the experiences of life, and that generates an energy through the brain. And I've got an image of the brain in the background here. So that generates the energy through the brain. This model's easier. So you thinking, feeling, and choosing, like right now, the audience is listening, you listening to me, I'm saying words, it's auditory stimulation, there's sound waves coming in. We process that, which means we think, feel, and choose about what we're hearing. That moves through the brain, because we need to use the brain to actually store the result of what we're thinking, feeling, and choosing, which are thoughts. And then we express those thoughts in our words and our actions. So there's this relationship, and if then that feeds back into the mind. So how our brain is functioning and the way we actually physically build our thoughts forms a feedback into our mind. And if we can self-regulate this process of how we think, feel, and choose, and how our brain is actually responding through because the brain is a responder to the thinking, feeling, and choosing. If we can learn to self-regulate that, we can then be much more efficient and, as you said, salubrious in how we make our decisions. So it's to make our decisions, we have to be able to stand back and observe our mind. So we have to literally use our mind to observe our mind, to clean up the mental mess, and in the turn to clean up the physical mess. So because the mind is moving through the brain, and the brain's responding, mind, brain are inseparable.
This really very quickly gets us to the heart of the matter here.
Yeah.
What your work is all about, what your book is all about, and that is that our minds are highly influenceable based upon certain techniques. In other words, we can change the response of our minds to external events. We have programs that are, we would say, locked in, but not actually. Programs that really dictate how we respond to challenges, how we respond to any situation. And what you're telling us in the book is that we can change how we respond, how we perceive, what our actions are, based upon how we are moment to moment confronted by any type of situation. That's really a powerful statement. It relies upon the brain's ability to rewire itself. You get into that, I think, in chapter 9, neuroplasticity, which is the hard wiring that takes place. But upstream of that, the idea that we can construct a paradigm whereby then this process takes place. And we can, even more importantly, direct this reconstruction of our minds, our perceptions, and our actions is really quite It's a pretty bold kind of concept, isn't it?
It is bold, and it is, as I said, it's bold, and it kind of almost seems to go against the last 30, 40 years of traditional scientific thinking, but it comes from 150 years of a lot of thinking of integrative medicine, or mind brain connection research, which shows that our mind is driving the brain. So I see the mind as the driver and the brain as the responder, as opposed to generator. And so neuroplasticity, which, as you just mentioned, is how the brain changes. It's in response. It doesn't change itself. It's if you're dead, your brain does nothing. But because, and this is probably the easiest way to understand mind and this ability that we have to control and influence brain and body, is because if you're alive, your brain is changing. The mere fact that you are breathing and living, your brain is changing. It's never the same moment to moment. So the listeners listening to us both now, you and I both know, they may not know that your brain's not the same as it was when we began 10 minutes ago. So every experience is changing the brain, and that we call neuroplasticity. And David, when I was still studying, it was back in the 80s. And as you know as well, because you were studying around that time too, we were trained that the brain could not change. I remember having many discussions with my professors in neuroscience and in my med courses that no, the brain is fixed. If you've had a traumatic brain injury, that's it. And therefore that's it for the rest of your life. So you would train your patients to compensate. And my argument to them was, well, if you're training your patients to compensate, you are still changing the brain and you're using the mind. So you're doing something. So the mind is definitely separate from the brain, because if I'm training someone to compensate, I'm working with their mind and I'm helping them to overcome whatever trauma they've suffered in their brain, from whatever, whether it's TBI, whether it's Alzheimer's, whether it's a learning issue, whether it's autism, or whatever the case may be. And so that's when I did some of the earliest research in neuroplasticity back in the 80s, late 80s, early 90s, on a traumatic brain injury, and how if you deliberately and intentionally teach a person how to direct their mind in a very focused way, doing various different paradigms, so maybe for learning, for academic, or just creative, or whatever it may be, or controlling emotions, but that you actually control that, almost as though you're operating in two minds, using one mind, like the wise mind, to control the mind that's not doing what it should. If you can make that a deliberate practice, you can improve and change functioning. And that's when and at that point I showed that you can actually improve how a person functions on a cognitive, social, emotional, intellectual level by an improved factor of 35 to 75%. And that launched me into literally another 30 years. So fast forward, so almost 44 decades now of research, working with different strata of people in different circumstances, extreme trauma, high socioeconomic, low socioeconomic, corporate, school, whatever I could. I even worked in war-torn Rwanda at one point. I worked in apartheid South Africa for 25 years in some of the worst areas, all trying to understand how are we using our mind to manage? What is mind? What are thoughts? And what's the impact on the body? And in my most recent clinical research, I've taken sort of all these years, updated everything, refined the technique, refined the theories I've developed, and did clinical trials to show people. And I've put the simplified version in the book. I have white papers and publications coming out too, but the simplified version, bottom line, showed that when you teach a person to mind manage, when you teach them to understand this is what mind is, thinking, feeling, choosing, this is how you can actually influence how you think, feel, and choose, and regulate how you think, feel, and choose, you will change the physical nature of your brain, which we can see through structure, MRIs. I use QEEGs. We also looked at blood. We looked at blood markers. So we looked at cortisol, the typical things, cortisol, homocysteine, and ACTH and DHA, all those kind of things. And we also looked at telomeres. And I'm particularly interested in telomeres because there's so much new research around showing how telomeres in the DNA are a great proxy for mind management. So what I wanted to show people was that you as an individual have this phenomenal ability to control your mind. And when you control your mind, there will be changes in your brain. There will be changes in your DNA. There will be changes physically in your body, your HPA axis, inflammation, immune system, cardiovascular, etc. You have a level of control. And if your brain and body are functioning at a higher level, well, then that feeds back into the mind, because and then you get set up a positive feedback loop. And part of that, which we maybe can discuss as a separate question or a separate sort of discussion, is how we view negativity in our current paradigm, or Western paradigm, and how that can negatively impact our healing and our decision making, and how we can shift that. So that's kind of the big picture of what I'm trying to help people understand.
Well, it is I think, a bit of a challenge. We all grew up in a time when we were highly influenced by science that occurred at the beginning of the 20th century by
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Santiago Ramon y Cajal in Spain, who said that, basically neurons and neural connections the word was immutable, but it was in Spanish
Exactly.
translated to the word immutable, meaning without ability to change. And then it took the work of people like Dr. Michael Merzenich, Dr.
Yeah.
Pascal Leon at Columbia, who really
Mm-hmm.
began to clearly demonstrate the notion that the brain has the ability to rewire itself gratefully. And certainly both of those researchers actually focused on the notion that it's not just participating in an activity that allows the brain to rewire, but it's being mentally engaged or paying attention to the activity. To the
Exactly.
extent that what Dr. Pascal Leon demonstrated was that you could learn to play a piece on the
Yeah.
piano if you're a piano player, and it would
In your mind.
restructure that part of your brain.
Mm-hmm.
But you could also learn it if you just visualize it and
Yeah.
thought about it. So, just mental participation alone is enough to induce neuroplastic changes in the brain. So, we've come a long way, as well as the notion of neurogenesis, that we grow new brain cells. Wow,
Absolutely.
never saw that one coming, although it was
No.
seen in virtually the entire the rest of the animal kingdom, including primates. But we strongly rejected that until, I guess, 1989 work
Midnight.
with Dr.
Yeah.
Erickson. But you talk about the mind management technique. And what I would like to explore is what are the specifics? You talk about 5 different steps that are really kind of the pillars. And then let's explore your research demonstrating, where it was put to the test, the profound effectiveness as it relates to anxiety and depression, which, are certainly pervasive issues in our modern times, and certainly far more pervasive during our troubled pandemic times.
Absolutely. Well, excellent question. I'm glad you referenced Cahill. I can never say his name, Cahill's work, and Leone. I've actually referenced both of them in my work too. Outstanding start of the process and getting us moving into the direction of being able to recognize that mind and brain work together, and that brain can change, that the brain is constantly changing, which is so fantastic. So what I did was, when I worked with traumatic brain injured patients and people in severe trauma, and working in situations in South Africa where there were no resources, I'd go into schools and I'd work in community centers and have thousands of people turning up. There wasn't the facility to give people individualized therapy. And so what I started doing was looking at what the science of thought and how what the mental space is in terms of mind, and what is thought, what is memory, and the level of influence that we can have over that. And from my work, as I said, I define mind as thinking, feeling, and choosing. The 3 go together. That's action. When we do think, feel, and choose, we generate a response in the brain, and you build thoughts. So, and I'm answering this, I'm going to come full circle to the 5 steps. Thoughts, as we know, look like trees in the brain, and a thought is different to a memory. So when I talk about a thought, I'm talking about the concept of the whole tree, and like a tree is made of branches, so are thoughts made of memories. So that's why when we recall an incident in our life, or a concept in our life, it's not just going to be one thing. It's one concept. It may be that childhood trauma, or that relationship with X, or that argument with X. That's the thought, but the details are the memories, and the details contain data and emotions. And there's what we can see of the thought in this portion over here. The branches are basically the behavioral aspects, what we're going to say and do, but they come from a perspective which comes from a root or an origin story. So when we look at thoughts that we create like this, then we have an experience, and maybe it's a trauma, maybe it's an argument, maybe it's a toxic, a pleasing person moment, or something, whatever it may be, or we read something in the news. That's a seed that's grown, planted, and immediately grows roots, and that's the origin story. The roots are all the detail of the memory, the data, the emotions, the events, etc. That produces a perspective, which is the tree trunk, which then produces these behavioral, emotional data memories, which then produce our words and our actions. So, and in that process, these are going to be generating signals. So how we present ourselves, how we communicate, how we make our decisions, how we interact with people, etc., is going to all be part of this, with the emotional or signals attached to them. So if we track it now that we have a traumatic experience, then instead of it looking nice, it's going to be distorted. And there's a lot of research, without going into too much scientific detail, about how proteins are folded incorrectly differently if someone has a traumatic experience versus, and how the vibrations on a quantum level in the dendrites and Hammerhoff's work and Sir Roger Penrose's work and that kind of stuff. There's a lot of work showing there is a difference in the brain, a lot of MRI research and so on. So to simplify this for people, that's healthy, this is unhealthy or toxic. And this would be a traumatic experience. And the brain, as you go through it, the brain is designed for survival, it's wired for love. The mind is wired for optimism. So we create a response, which is a coping mechanism, which is in the moment, but it may not be sustainable. And generally isn't, but it's for the moment, that's what we sustain. So there's the event, it happens, you grow the root, the seed is dropped of the abuse, for example, that's all the detail of the event, that creates a perspective of I am shame or whatever, that then produces data and behaviors and emotions that generate how you function in life. And this is toxic, so it's going to generate signals that the sort of emanation or the signals coming from this are going to be things like anxiety, depression, bipolar, schizophrenia, whatever, depending on the level of severity. So those are not illnesses per se. From the viewpoint that I take, I don't believe those are illnesses. And from the research I've done and the scientific research that I've analyzed, depression, anxiety, schizophrenia would fall in the same category as anger, frustration, etc. So in all of them are warning signals. They are telling you they are symptoms of an underlying issue. So someone who's gone through a sexual childhood trauma, it's pervasive and ubiquitous, and perhaps they have suppressed it for years and they hit their early 20s or they hit their early teenagerhood and they're in a relationship and it's what was suppressed for years explodes, and it explodes in behavioral manifestations and signals like depression, anxiety, extreme anxiety, whatever, burnout, stress. And what we need to do is we need to be able to see those emotional warning signals and the physical responses in our body, because memory doesn't just build in the brain, it also builds in every cell of our body. And as we well know, there's somewhere between 37 trillion and 100 trillion cells collectively in the brain and body. So a memory thought with all of its memories, so a thought with all of its little branches, its memories, would store in the mind, in the gravitational fields, and there's a lot of Nobel Prize winning research on that concept. Then in the brain as well as these arbor-like structures, which were identified very early on, and also in the DNA of the body, which is more recent research, but we've talked about body memories, but there is now a lot of work being done on how memories are stored in our DNA and the epigenetics and all that kind of thing. So if we've got memory stored in 3 places and we've experienced, for example, a childhood trauma, that's in our brain, in our mind, and in our body. And if it's suppressed, they're alive and living and dynamic, even though they're traumatic. So at some point, they're going to explode physically in our body. So maybe we start getting cardiovascular issues or GI issues or a combination or whatever. And also in the way that we are behaving and in the feelings that we have. So the feelings that we have, things like depression and anxiety, are warning signals, symptoms of an underlying cause. So instead of saying...
What you're saying, that this response is hardwired, but hardwired doesn't mean it's indelible. That it can, in fact, be changed.
It's malleable. It's malleable. Absolutely. Absolutely.
There's such a push these days, and with good reason. I'm all in. In fact, we had this discussion, I think, the other night in Clubhouse.
Yes.
That of mindfulness practices, and the upside. We've talked about it in our books, etc. And you, I think, are all in favor. But in your book, you're saying it's not enough. Why mindfulness practices are helpful, but not enough to really unwind this degree of maladaptive relationship within the brain?
Excellent question. I'm glad you've answered that. This took years to make, and it's been there for years, for example. So it's going to take quite a lot of work to get rid of it. And what we see from neuroscientific research, some really great research coming out of Toronto in neuroscience, that when you are aware of something, now you can't see the thought. If I'm aware, now I'm aware. Now I can see the thought. So in other words, when I become mindfully aware of something, this is the good side of mindfulness. When I become mindfully aware of something, I actually now bring it into my conscious awareness. It gives me a chance to employ my veto power. Benjamin Libet's work on veto power. We can actually now start consciously observing our non-conscious thoughts and we can start doing something about it on a scientific level or a neuroscientific level. The protein bonds, for example, and the vibrations in the little protein bonds would start weakening. So in simple language, these branches are now malleable, they're changeable. So by being aware and mindful of my depression, anxiety, etc., being aware of my emotional and physical warning signals and my behaviors and my perspective, and trying to find the origin story. So going right down from the signals to the behaviors, emotions, perspective to the origin story. So tracking through the whole thought. In being mindfully aware of those shifts the power balance to where when I was just being this depressed and not functioning and getting stuck and ruminating, I was controlled. But by being aware, I now know why I'm being controlled, why I was feeling depression. So you shift from I am depressed to I feel depressed because of. So mindfulness does that. But mindfulness on its own, if it's extracted out of its original context within the meditation techniques of Buddhism and the various different Eastern philosophies, it's not meant to just be stuck in the non-judgmental looking at me now. You can start with that, but as you and I both well know, we're not ruminating. We switch off to the external and switch on to the external and self-talk and go inside of our minds, a mental chatter, whatever you want to call it. I just call it internal thinking. We do that half to 3/4 of our day. And when we're in that state, we also temporal, we time travel. So we go from the past to the present, to the future, to the past, because that's how we make sense of our life. So to tell someone to just stay in mindfulness and that will solve your problem isn't enough. It's only the preparation for the work of, okay, now I'm aware. Now what do I do? So, and I saw this in my research. I showed this very, very clearly in my recent clinical trials.
It's a bit of irony, though, because we're talking about the functionality of the prefrontal cortex, which is enhanced in its momentary functionality as well as long-term functionality by various meditative and mindfulness practices, and yet that is the area of the brain that allows us to recruit information from past and conceptualize the future in terms of our actions. So it's a bit of a dichotomy, but I would say that the notion that, Hebbian theory, neurons that fire together wire together. The more let something happen, the more likely it is to build ultimately a network around it. And you bring up the concept of toxic thoughts and how it's really important for us to deal with toxic thoughts early on before they have a chance to then influence neural networks and insinuate themselves, influencing our established neural networks. So we have to kind of work on how we identify toxic thinking and then utilize your techniques in order to allow those not to ultimately work their way into the hardware.
Absolutely. So to come to your point of the frontal lobe and then controlling toxic thoughts, when we're mindful, I totally agree. There's a lot of research showing increased alpha, increased synchrony between the alpha waves like a bridge between the non-conscious and the conscious mind. So when alpha activity increases, we will have increase in gamma, which means integrative thinking. So we will get more integration. We will see increases in beta, which means you're really online. In other words, we're going to see a change that's very positive. But what I showed in my research is that if you just stay mindful and you're just aware, but you don't do something with it, which is if you just identify the toxicity, but you don't now say, okay, now what am I going to do about this? Then it's going to get worse. So we saw with our subjects in the control group, for example, that we made them very mindfully aware of, through all the testing we did, of the issue why they came into the clinical trial, so whatever they were battling with. But the experimental group weren't just made aware, they also got the process of mind management, which is the neurocycle, which is basically not a technique as much as it is a process of how you can manage your mind to manage your mind. And into that, you can put whatever techniques you want. So there's so many beautiful techniques out there. And I put a few of them in my book, but I call them directed neuroplasticity techniques. But it's to see the first sort of phase of any kind of healing of toxic issues, whether it's a toxic habit or trauma or just battling to cope with day-to-day life, feeling burnt out and that kind of thing, the first phase is to recognize the power of the mind to identify, to the veto power of the conscious mind. So awareness and mindfulness brings that. But the mindfulness that I'm talking about going deeper into is get mindful, but then get mindful to another level where you start gathering awareness. So mindful of the moment and all the beautiful, and that I talk about that in the book as brain and in my treatment protocols and so on. Mindfulness, breathing, all of those are so vital in preparing the brain and the body, getting the frontal lobe, right oxygen levels, blood flow, the energy flow, the energy responses in terms of delta, beta, alpha, all the gamma, all of those balance. But then you have to gather awareness, and gathering means the process of, okay, I am feeling what? I'm feeling depressed, or I'm feeling anxious, or I'm feeling a combination of, or my moods are swinging, or I'm feeling like this hovering anxiety. It's then what is it doing in my body? How am I feeling physically? Then what are my behaviors? So I'm gathering awareness of not just non-judgmentally observing them, but now I'm gathering awareness of more detail of them. And then that takes you straight into another step. And this is where you take mindfulness beyond, is you get mindful, then you gather awareness and more detail of what you're mindful of. And you can bring in the past and the future. Standard mindfulness, that's a preparation, is just being present in the moment. But
so
you have to take
that's the reflection step.
It's actually part of the gather. So preparation is basic mindfulness or basic breathing, basic tapping, havening, anything you want to do to get your brain physically prepared. Then you're going to gather. Gathering awareness, like gathering is an embracing process. And I gather awareness of, I feel depressed. You get more specific. I feel depressed. I'm feeling anxious. You start describing the warning signals. You start linking the emotions then to the physical state in your body. So you're still in a mindfulness, but now you're gathering more detail. So step one is gathering detail. The pre-step is all the standard mindfulness breathing techniques and all that stuff. Then the reflect step is where you now start analyzing. You do a mental autopsy. This whole thing is brain surgery without the blood, in essence. But you are
need the blood.
Yeah, need the blood. The reflect is such a big word. It's such an all-encompassing word. Reflect is looking present, past, future, temporal distancing, being able to stand back and observe your own thinking. And it's looking at the ask, answer, discuss. Why? I feel like this. Why? I feel like this because this, but why? Why? Ask, answer, discuss, where you explore and you put the thought on trial. You become like a detective and you dig down. And that digs down into the depths of the non-conscious mind, which is different from the subconscious mind, which is different from the conscious mind. The non-conscious mind's always going. The conscious mind's only awake when you're awake. The subconscious is a bridge. And we have to learn to tune into the subconscious to hear the warning signals, and then dig deep. As we dig deeper, we start getting into the non-conscious mind. It's only then that we're going to get to the root. So then you get to your third step, which is what we all talk about, which is writing. And we know the benefits of writing, but you can write and you can write. And the way that I teach writing is to use a structure that I developed years ago called the metacog, which is a way of writing on paper that's not completely new. There's similar concepts that have been around, but it's basically the idea of branched writing. So instead of just writing meticulously in lines, you start in the middle of the page and you work clockwise around the page and you write words on lines, and all lines are connected and you categorize. So it kind of forces you to put your brain on paper, kind of copying the structure of a tree or a neuron. And that helps you literally pour your brain on paper. So you don't worry about any literary skill at this point, or having to be, even if it's a big jumbled mess, the idea is just get it out, which, as you know, activates the flow between the frontal lobe and the amygdala and the hippocampus and the basal ganglia. You just get a complete opening up, and we see a nice balance between all the different wave energy forms, etc., etc. It also can be quite scary and quite traumatic. So we can see peaks. We saw a lot of what we call red brain peaks across the brain, corpus callosum, where we saw peaks of anxiety. So that a lot of little bursts of high beta, and which is quite normal. I mean, if you've been traumatized and you're suddenly realizing that your aggressive behavior or your withdrawal or your desire or your suicidal thoughts, you suddenly go to therapy and you start becoming aware, that is very scary. And I call that the treatment effect, where it gets worse before it gets better. You know, as a physician, neurologist, surgery, you've got to get cut up and get sore to get better. It's the same principle. We understand that with surgery, we understand that with athletics. and physical things. But very often when it comes to mind, we don't want to hurt to get better, but you have to. You have to face the pain. The only way out is through. So the reflect step starts taking you down, and then the right step, you capture what you've reflected on, which takes you deeper. And then you start a reorganizing step, which is or a reconceptualizing step, which is the recheck. And the recheck is how you go and look at what you've written and you try and make sense of it. What are the patterns? What are the triggers? What are the activators? Triggers is such a loaded word, so I prefer using what are the activators? What are the patterns? When does it happen? How? What? How can I see it differently? What is another angle? What advice would you give yourself if someone came to you with the same problem? What advice would you give them? So it's going into that reconceptualizing state. And then the last step is an active reach, which is a simple action that grows out of the recheck, which is, okay, this is what I've learned today. This is all I can handle today, because we've got to limit what we do per day when it comes to any kind of toxic trauma work. I learned today that I see myself as shame, but I don't need to see myself as shame. I don't believe it yet, but my active reach would be every time I feel shame, I'm going to remind myself I am not shame. And tomorrow I'll unpack it more. So you go through a process.
So, there's a lot said that we just have to think more positively. And I think there's really almost at times people develop a sense of guilt that they can't think positively enough.
Exactly.
And I think you pull people away from that, recognizing that this isn't easy stuff, first of all, and that these patterns have been laid down for years and years, since we were born, or possibly even prior to that, and that it's not going to happen overnight. I was very taken which I think is really great in writing a book, about how you yourself responded. I think you lost an earring in the hot tub, wasn't that?
Yes, yes. Very special, yeah.
How you basically lost it. I don't mean lost the earring, but you lost control and you were miffed, and how you looked upon that sort of as an exercise and took a step back and realized how, for whatever reason, it just activated a previous engram, a pattern of thinking in your brain. It went down certain circuits that were turned on, and you weren't pleasant for a little while and found your earring and tried to put the pieces back together. The point I'm making is, hey, I could speak as well, believe me, that we're all doing the best we can. We live in being alive is a
mental
time of challenge anyway. That's part of the human experience, which allows us to make progress as we solve our challenges. And certainly these days, those challenges are manifold, increased. And so it's no wonder that people are having issues as it relates to mental health. And yet, kindly and lovingly, you've provided some really powerful tools that are, face it, you and I are having a pretty in-depth discussion right now because we love this stuff.
Yes, and we love science.
I just want our listeners to know, viewers to know, that the book is written in a way that it's very, very understandable. And beyond that, more importantly, very user-friendly in terms of what are the take-home tools that people are going to get to restructure their thinking patterns and, more importantly, their response patterns. How do you respond when you are confronted by, call it noxious stimuli if you want to be scientific, but just things that are threatening and could otherwise ruin your day?
Yes.
How can you take a step back and look at it and process it in a different way? I was at a Deepak Chopra conference years ago, and I was very taken by somebody challenged him and said, Dr. Chopra, what should I do? I'm a smoker. I don't want to be a smoker. And, aside from the addictive nature of nicotine, he said, well, the next time you smoke a cigarette, here's what I'd like you to do. I'm not going to tell you to stop smoking cigarettes, though we know it's threatening to your health.
Yeah.
Go outside, sit on a chair, and smoke your cigarette, but think about it while you're smoking. And in other words, make a connection to
Very
it.
good.
As opposed to doing it mindlessly, and then you can make better decisions. And that has really stayed with me for many years because, we tend to engage ourselves in behaviors that are mindless. And what I think you are doing in your book is you're bringing a level of control back to the picture that is so lacking and yet so darn necessary. And I have to say that when I was reading the book about the various tools, I was saying to myself, people need to know this, and we should know this. This should be part of our toolkit.
Yeah.
Instead of thinking that we're totally at the mercy of our brain wiring and we're always going to respond, whether it's an olfactory stimulus or a
Hmm.
confrontation or a sound or an innuendo, perhaps misinterpreted from another person, whatever it may
Yeah.
be, we see that we respond negatively, and sometimes our responses to making decisions about what is good for ourselves is predicated by inputs from previous times that we can rewrite. So I guess what I'm
Exactly.
saying is it's really empowering information, and I'm hoping our
Thank you.
viewers get that. Again,
Thank you.
we got deep into the woods on this, but that's because we like to, and there are
Yeah.
plenty of our viewers who love to go to that
Yeah.
place. But I'm trying to open this up to everybody. So
That's
um,
wonderful.
we're very excited about your book, and certainly very excited about all the work you're doing. What's the future hold for you? What are you doing next?
Well, I've already got the next research trial, which I actually chatted briefly to you and your son Austin a year ago. Oh no, not a year ago, about 6 months or so ago. So there is. I want to take this research further, and I want to try and make it accessible. My goal is to try and help people understand that the current narrative of mental health is a very scary narrative and a very unscientific narrative, and to tell people after a pandemic or during a pandemic, as you said, it's going to be with us for years, and I agree with you, to say, okay, now you're mentally ill, on top of maybe losing a loved one, and on top of maybe losing your finances and all isolation. You don't need don't need to be told you've got a neuropsychiatric brain disease when all you are doing is responding to an adverse or noxious environment or situation that you had no control over. So I want to try and help people recognize that we can't control events and circumstances, but we can control our responses. And if our responses are depression or anxiety, not to be scared of those, but to actually embrace those, which is very Eastern in its philosophical bent. But there's research that came out of Texas University and University of Japan just recently, and it confirmed a piece of research that I had just done, and I actually write about this in the clinical trials too, an aspect that I hadn't directly looked at, but indirectly discovered, and that was that the way that you view the experience that you're having, the feeling of depression, the feeling of pressure, the feeling of frustration, anger, irritation, if you see that as bad and something that's terrible and I need to get rid of it, and if I keep feeling like that, oh, there's an illness in me like cancer or a brain tumor or something, or diabetes, that makes you worse. And we saw that in directly in how the people's functioning, our control group, for example, we saw their telomeres shorten. And to get sciencey now, people know what the DNA is, the DNA strand, chromosomes. If you pull a chromosome out, it looks like a little X. And just for the sake of ease, I always cross my fingers, and my fingernails are the telomeres. And I'm really simplifying this, but it's very powerful. Telomeres are considered a proxy for mind management. So if we are
Great
managing,
thought. I mean, people are thinking about telomeres as being related to diet, exercise, levels
and
of.
most of the research is done around that.
But I will say we have we're doing an interview next week with Dr. Alyssa Eppel, who wrote
Yes,
this
yes,
book,
yes.
The
One of my
Telomere Effect,
heroes.
and
Yeah,
she's a psychologist. So
yeah.
most of the book that I've already been
I
through
know her
is
book.
really
Yeah.
about how our mindset, our mindfulness practices, etc., are replicated, or that the telomere length is really a proxy for our mindset, as if you will. So
Absolutely, and I reference her in her work has been a very big, huge guidance of my work. A very strong guideline for how I analyzed and decided to include telomeres was very much stimulated by her, Elisa Eppel's work, because she's one of the first people who's actually talking about mind and telomeres. As you say, it's always been diet related. If you and she also proposed, and you've read the book, but that you can. It's not 5 years before you'll see changes. It's shorter periods of time. And I consulted with quite a few experts in telomeres because this fascinated me. So I wanted to see, can we make a change? And we found in 9 weeks there was a significant change in the telomeres, in 9 weeks of mind management. And if people didn't have, like the control group, didn't have mind management, their telomeres got worse. Their cellular aging got worse. Their inflammation got worse. Everything got worse. The control group had a significantly opposite effect. The telomeres, they're significantly increased in length, health, etc. And that was only 9 weeks. So it's very pioneering. It's very early research, but it's just a very clear mind-body link, and stress undergirds the importance of why we need to focus on dealing with our mind. Mind is you're never away from your mind. Everything you do, whatever you breathing, eating, walking, choosing your outfit, choosing your food, reading a book, your mind's always involved. So my argument, if mind is always what's behind what you're doing, we need to understand it and we need to know how to self-regulate it. And when we do self-regulate it, we can self-regulate it in the moment and for the big stuff like the traumas and the toxic habits and the things that are keeping us stuck and that kind of thing. So I'm proposing working on it on 2 levels. And that the first most obvious level is dealing with trauma and dealing with toxic habits that are keeping us stuck and how to heal that over time, which is something maybe we should just touch on. But the other element is also in the moment stuff, which is very much related to, Denise Apple's work, my work, a lot of people's, your work as well, where how do we make good decisions in the moment? How do we think, feel, and choose effectively now? And that's what I've shown with my research, is that you can literally control your mind you can use your mind to control your mind, to change your brain, to change your body health, right down to the level of the telomeres. And we saw it happening incredibly fast. It wasn't just by 9 weeks. We already saw telomere changes, blood changes within 21 days, within 3 weeks. So it was interesting to see that shift. Did I answer the question? We kind of diversified there, but we were, if I may just talk about the time frame, because I think that's super significant when it comes to, because I keep talking about 9 weeks. What most people think when they think about habits is they think of 3 weeks, which is a myth, as I'm sure you're aware, and I put that in the book too. About
in the book
years,
you say 63 days, but we'll leave it at 9 weeks.
Yeah, 63 days, 9 weeks. So people think it's 21 days because there was a myth started years ago by a surgeon that just proposed it as an idea. It wasn't even science, and it just got picked up. But so I wanted to see that, and there's just not enough scientific work showing how long does it actually take to form the memories inside a thought that they become long-term. And what is a long-term versus a short-term memory anyway? What is the time involved? How long does it really take to change a habit and so on? And what I found from the work is that at 21 days, we definitely are able to embrace, process, and reconceptualize a toxic thought into a healthy thought. But what we see is that this thought, after 21 days, we see gamma peaks in the brain, which shows that the neuroplasticity is happening, integration is happening. We see in behavior, people after 3 weeks of doing the neurocycle as a mind management process in their daily for 15 to 45 minutes, they would say things like, at the beginning of the study, I am depressed, I'm clinically depressed. By day 21, they're saying, I felt depression, I still experience it, but I now know why, and I now know how to manage it. At 9 weeks, they were saying, I'm getting this under control. I can see it will still happen in my life. I see it as helpful. I don't see it as negative. And at 6 months, it was sustained. So what we're seeing is that at 3 weeks, we have formed this change, but for behavior to actually express in our life. In other words, for people to see you changing and for you to experience the change, you need to practice deliberately and consciously using that new reconceptualized thought for an additional 6 weeks. So it doesn't require so much time every day. It requires much less time. So for the first 3 weeks of making a change in your life, dealing with a toxic trauma or a toxic habit or building a new habit in your life, the first few weeks you need to spend at least 15 to 45 minutes each day going through the 5 steps. So it's a whole sequence program which I walk you through. I've also got an app, by the way, that goes with us called the Neurocycle app, which used to be called the Switch app. So it walks you through the audio version, therapy, online sort of thing in an app. For the first 3 weeks, you spend 15 to 45 minutes a day doing the 5 steps. From day 22 to 63, you simply do step 5, the final step 5, and you put that in the reminder function on your phone or the app version if you're using the app, and it just pops up, and all you do is consciously and deliberately remind yourself up to 7 times a day. And there's a whole lot of science behind all that too, which I won't go into. So it's very simple. The time you take between 22 and 42 days is only 7 seconds to maybe 2 minutes a day, but it gives sufficient energy. Energy is never lost. Energy is always transferred. And for something to have sufficient energy for it to impact behavior change, it's a bit of the concept of wiring together, firing together. It's giving sufficient energy to the neuron to be able to generate enough energy to impact behavior change on a neurological level. On a mind level, it's having sufficient energy to move from the unconscious to the conscious. It takes that extra 42 days. And that's why so many people, David, give up. They'll go today. It's very easy to get through a week, but most people don't really go beyond a week, maybe 2 weeks. And at 14 days, you get the mastery mirage happening where you think, oh, I got this. And then 3 weeks later or 3 months later, I'm stuck again. What happened? I did the work. And then they get very frustrated. So that's why I spend a lot of time emphasizing, hey, you are going to really have to work at one concept for 63 days. And that may sound
you
like a
know,
lot,
again,
but
we're all, it's a cliche these days, we're all in this together, but I just want to say that, every day, everyone is challenged. At least everyone that I've ever met in my life. I've not met anybody who's really reached a place of gaining that level of direction of their thoughts and intracerebral relationships, if you will, the
exactly.
activation of various um, brain pathways that they don't experience negativity. And it's a lifelong process. I guess it'll always be with us. But I think you made very clear in your book that it's worth doing. It really is.
Mm.
There's something at the end of the rainbow if we're able to at least try. It's always a job, work in progress, but certainly exceedingly valuable, especially as we are challenged these days. Thank
I
you
agree
for
with you. No,
spending
can I
time with
mean,
us today. Really terrific information.
thank you. I wanted to just mention one thing about the end of the rainbow. I love the way you said that. But what I want to throw out to your listeners is just, and for myself, we're all in a mental mess all the time, but we can control it. But the thing is that our mind is malleable, our mind is trainable, and it's okay. It's okay to feel that your mind is changing anyway. So here's the big picture. If you don't manage your mind, it's still going to change, and your brain is still going to change, and you're still going to feel the effect, and you're going to feel awful. So you may as well use that to your advantage. Grab the awful and turn it around and manage your mind so that you get much more proficient. So I still battle, I still
I
fall,
think that
but it
whole concept
improves.
is something that's not widely appreciated, though now we've got decades of science supporting the fact that the brain
Exactly.
rewires itself constantly throughout our lifetimes. And that rewiring is dependent upon two things: what we experience, which we can choose, and also the degree of attention that we put to a particular event or task or activity that we are engaged in. So it's the attention and it's the activity, if you will,
Exactly.
that leads to these changes. And again, it was chapter 9. It was wonderful, an area we've been interested in for a long time. That you
Yeah.
can direct that, you can
So good.
take the reins back and control where it's going. So very empowering.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your time and thank you for your work. I always love talking to you. It's always
Oh, thank
wonderful.
you, Dr. Leaf. We will talk
Thank
soon,
you.
and again,
Yes.
we'll talk more about the book. But thanks for being with us.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
Well, this was really empowering information. First, we set the stage for what's going on. The idea is that what's going on in our minds is being threatened by the world around us. We know that to be true. But how empowering it is using this program that Dr. Leaf eloquently describes, both today on Empowering Neurologists and certainly in the book, that we have these really great tools to rein it in, as I talked about in the introduction, to really put ourselves back in the driver's seat for better decision making. I hope you enjoyed the program today. Again, the book, Cleaning Up Your Mental Mess, something we can all do. I'm Dr. David Perlmutter. Thank you for joining me here on The Empowering Neurologist, and we will be back soon. Bye-bye.